Hello, I am Andres Rackauer, an intern at the Mohammad bin Fahd Program for Strategic Research and Studies. Today we are joined by the director of the PMBF program at UCF, David Dumke, an expert on Middle East-U.S. relations. Mr. Dumke has worked in several private firms, electoral campaigns in the Middle East, numerous NGOs, and done consulting for several Middle Eastern governments, working especially with Egypt and Saudi Arabia. His political background has helped him understand the intricacies of the region and see the difference between how these events are being perceived there and how they're interpreted by Western media. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So my first question is, while not much of the official White House policy on the Middle East has been discussed yet, what do you think is going to be Trump's attempt?
Well, it remains highly unclear what it is. I think in terms of an overall foreign policy as well as specific to the region. Some of that is the nature of how President Trump sees the world and his advisors. And some of it also is a legacy of his two immediate predecessors. One who made some mistakes in terms of how the Iraq war would play out and what change meant in the throughout the Middle East region. And then his successor, President Obama, who devoted most of his time to trying to put out fires and minimize some of the damage from the previous administration, neither of which was a particularly successful regional policy. So we don't start from something that was in great shape to begin with. Then you move into a president that hasn't the experience in terms of policy making side, which really leaves a lot of questions open. And that's led to a lot of unforeseen consequences, and we really just don't know how it'll play out yet.
What do you think will be the long-term impact of his latest trip to Riyadh?
You know, one trip does not a policy make. So again, how this is read, we really won't know now. I mean, you can assess a trip immediately impact based on what's signed, what's said, but what that actually means as it plays out can be a lot of different things. What I think we're going to see consistently in the region is through the process of the last 15 to 20 years, you've gone from the United States really working through regional allies to maintain stability of the region, then upsetting that stability, some of it which was natural evolution, some of which was because of U.S. decisions, period, namely Iraq, but also support of reform movements that may have had different outcomes than people anticipated. And of course you had leaders that died or faded away along the way as well. But what you get now is, whereas the relationship between Saudi Arabia's actions in the past, and Egypt's actions in the past, and Turkey's for that matter, all kind of were based on their relationship with the United States. Now, with the U.S. not playing the same kind of leadership role, it's still an important player, but it isn't the pivotal player because it doesn't really have a policy. What are we trying to get to? So each of these countries is trying to define what its national interests truly are and how to play with the others. And of course, there's issues between each of them, and of course, between all of them and Iran, on the other hand. So we haven't quite decided how, the world hasn't seen how those countries will play together. And until they kind of understand what the rules of the road are, they can't really work collectively to do things like solve Libya or Yemen or Syria or, much of Iraq. So we're kind of in a situation where it's very uncomfortable, a lot of instability. Some of this is evolutionary, some of it's by bad decision making in the past.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, would you say it's a similar impact in his trip to Israel and Palestine?
No, I think in large part the Israel-Palestine conflict, it has a long history and is tragic in its own right. But that's almost removed from the rest of the region at this point. I don't mean to say that it doesn't matter. It does. Obviously, the history's wound up, and a lot of the efforts of the United States and other countries of the years is making sure that conflict was isolated and didn't spread into these regions. Well, now, because the rest of the region is actually in conflict, that conflict is almost managed. That's very cruel to say from a Palestinian perspective in particular. But that's kind of an issue that has to be solved in its own right, and the players are the Palestinians and the Israelis, and then how they work with outside focus. It's different. With Riyadh, a visit to Riyadh wasn't just meeting with the Saudi leadership, but it was also meeting with the heads of state of all these other Islamic countries, particularly in the Middle East, North Africa region. So that was actually more important given all the other surrounding issues. How President Trump and President Sisi of Egypt interact or can work together actually has impact in 10 other places potentially,
of course,
and the region overall. Whereas kind of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and trying to get involved in that peacemaking is good in its own right, but doesn't quite have the same ramifications as it once had.
I see. Do you see the Trump administration having any sort of goal in mind for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, I mean, they say they want peace, and but how many times have we heard that before? I mean, so on the one hand, it's ridiculous because you can't just say, all right, we're going to have peace because we want it. I mean, everyone said that, and we don't have any results. On the other hand, I will say this. The formula that has been embraced by the United States for the last 25 years, which is, or longer actually, is based on the Oslo formula. These were discussions and dialogue between the Israelis and the Palestinians, PLO, and then eventually the Palestinian Authority, series of interim agreements and confidence buildups, which was promised to lead to a two-state solution. Well, after 25 years, this was supposed to be something of a timeline of 5 years, not 25 years. You'd have to be foolish to say, we're going to do the same thing over and over again and get different results.
Right.
I mean, we've truly had some of our best diplomats work on this, and it hasn't gone anywhere. So from the Trump perspective, you can say, all right, the experts, quote unquote, as defined by the establishment, failed for so long. Bring in the amateurs and, can they do any worse? So I wouldn't say it's hopeless, but let's not be naive. The issues are still largely the same. And you have Israel that's even less flexible than it was in the past, and the Palestinians, which are in a weaker position than it was. And, the Palestinians, while they desperately want a solution, they're not just going to roll over now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's not acceptable either. So,
of course. So what are your thoughts on the development between Qatar and the 5 neighbors that broke diplomatic relations with them last month?
Well, I think this is obviously a very surprising development. I mean, there's been tension with Qatar for some time, between Qatar and the rest of the region, but the rest of the region never quite acted together to isolate Qatar. There was a movement by some of the GCC countries to do so a couple of years ago. That was resolved relatively peacefully after a diplomatic standoff, not nearly of the seriousness of today's. Qatar has been kind of the Woody Woodpecker of the region for a long time, which is pretty much an antagonist. Now they've hit above their belt, above their weight in terms of influence. This is a very small country, but they've championed some very liberal causes. They've also kind of championed a little of everything across the board. That's given them some options. It's given them some influence, good, bad, and otherwise. Anyway, we know some of the reasons for this conflict. How does it end is a big question here. There doesn't seem to be the wiggle room right now. I know Secretary of State Tillerson's over there trying to negotiate, but his message isn't even the same as President Trump's at times. So we don't quite know who. Again, this is kind of what I was saying about kind of this Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia troika. You could also throw the Emirates in there, but for simplicity's sake, really it's those three countries, and how they work together or apart. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of a test of that. So Qatar is an issue in its own, but it's also an issue between them. Now, Saudi Arabia and Egypt are on the same side of this for the time being, but not for the same reasons. Egypt's primary concern in this is support of the Muslim Brotherhood, which Qatar has done. Saudi Arabia's, while that's a concern, it's a secondary one compared to the nature of Qatar's relationship with Iran, which Egypt, again, is concerned about, but that's not their primary concern. Turkey, of course, Qatar is the first country who supported President Erdogan in the attempted coup, which was actually a year ago, just this week. So there's a personal loyalty there, too. Erdogan is from a party that is a Muslim Brotherhood-rooted party. So there's some other things. And Turkey had an agreement, a defense pact, where they have a base in Qatar with troops. So, they're in a position of this is now a personal affront to Erdogan from these other countries. So it's a quite serious split. Saudi Arabia had seen a few years ago, seeing that Iran was really their biggest threat, kind of a united Sunni front against Iran, which included Turkey and Egypt. Their efforts to kind of bring Turkey and Egypt together failed largely, because outstanding issues of the Muslim Brotherhood, among others. But that kind of failed, and now we have such a huge split within the Sunni ranks. So we'll see how it plays out. You always can look as long as it stays on a diplomatic level, there's always the possibility for some kind of resolution, which I think it would be incredibly dangerous if they couldn't resolve this in a relatively quick manner, for a lot of the reasons they're all involved in it. But again, would this have happened 10 years ago, when U.S. leadership in the region was so much assumed that it kind of dictated how countries acted towards each other, the extent to which they'd go, because they didn't want to upset the apple cart. So it kind of highlights what I was saying earlier about the lack of U.S. leadership. And again, this is not President Trump's fault alone. This is 3 administrations in a row that really had kind of a hazy regional policy. So again, we'll see how it plays out.
Right. So, just to emphasize, how would the world be impacted by this conflict right now, or these breaking of diplomatic ties? Like, what would the world impact be if this were to escalate?
I mean, the key factor is, how will it escalate? Few people are predicting any kind of a military showdown, but let's just say Saudi Arabia's biggest beef in this is Iran's involvement. Now, what if Iran now sees, like it has in other places, this is an easy way to really upset our primary regional adversary in Riyadh, that we're going to double down on our support of Qatar. And by the way, Qatar and Iran have working relations but aren't exactly tight. Mm-hmm. But something like this, what if that led to them actually becoming tight? That could create a bigger problem and actually exacerbate some of the concerns of Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. There's also, of course, so that's one, is, what does this do with Iran? The other is, what does this do with Turkey in the region? Turkey has other conflicts with countries in the region because of the Syrian involvement, again, with Egypt over the Muslim Brotherhood. A lot of different considerations there, and if these countries aren't talking, or things get even more hostile, the result of that is actually really not something you want to see. Of course, the remote possibility of some kind of military thing would be disastrous, because you're talking about a place which houses the largest United States base in the region. It has a Turkish base there. You also have, just in terms of global impact, you have so much oil, petroleum interest, natural gas, that are all at stake in this very small place geographically. So there's a lot of consequences potentially. We just don't know how it'll play out. And one of the U.S. roles in the past in situations like this, and again, I can't think of one that's exactly similar, although there was this 2014 standoff with Qatar that I referenced earlier. But in the past, the U.S. role would be to make sure these countries don't escalate problems, and you can come up with a solution that saves face for both, because they're all important to American interests, and regional stability is important to American interests and the entire region's interests. That's what Secretary of State Tillerson's trying to do. So far, the countries aren't blinking. And one has to wonder, because if one of the reasons they're not blinking is these coalitions of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the Emirates, and there's another 10 or odd countries involved one way or another, but those are the big 3. Their work together in the past hasn't always been sustainable. So you almost wonders who's going to blink first within this group. Is that a cause of it? I'm just speculating here.
Of course.
Because we don't know. Because you have to have a way that saves face, answers the concerns that they're having, but also allows Qatar to save face too. And then, of course, there's also the question of Turkey and Iran and et cetera. But that is the traditional U.S. role in this. Whether we can play it, this is actually a test on the U.S. as well as all these other countries.
Right. So what is your take on the contradicting statements made by President Trump about his thoughts on Islam here in the United States, especially in the campaign, versus those made in Riyadh?
Well, I mean, you know, anyone who can tell exactly what President Trump means is really not being sincere. I mean, this is a guy who's proven unpredictable. I mean, if you look at past presidents, the history in United States elections, what a candidate says and what a president-elect and president does are two different things. That's not to mean they're not insincere, but traditionally it's, you know, China's a classic example. Most candidates always complain about China's human rights record and trade and everything. Bill Clinton being a classic one. He used this to beat up President George H.W. Bush. Then when he became president, China got most favored nation, trade status, among other things.
Right.
So it's kind of the bark. You're playing to different constituencies. One of the things with President Trump you can say is someone who doesn't have any elective experience. Maybe it's better, maybe it's worse. What they say in the campaign trail they're still trying to do, you know, consequences be damned, on the one hand. On the other hand, there is still a tendency historically to what a candidate says and what someone who has to govern actually does. So you can complain about Muslims, for example, but who's doing the bulk of the fighting against ISIS right now? It's all Muslims. So, I mean, you can't have it both ways. So there's a dose of reality even coming into President Trump. That said, you know, how he wakes up in the morning and what he starts tweeting is anyone's guess.
Right. So I know you've already mentioned it, but what are some of the mistakes, or I guess some of the very important mistakes that past administrations have made in the Middle East, and what lessons should we learn from those?
I mean, one thing is, I mean, there's a lot of mistakes, and you'd have to really go historically by, you know, administration to administration. Some mistakes are very earnest. Some of them are very naive, etc. But I think the one thing is you can't believe your own rhetoric too much, okay, on the one hand. So a lot of, in recent times, so 2011, we had what's been called the Arab Spring. You had all these revolts. Americans instantly kind of connected that with democracy movements per se, and thought and believed, because that's largely our experience, that's largely what we saw in Eastern Europe, where there was a little more familiarity with the system. That's kind of the evolution we saw, and so that's how we read what was happening. And then you could go to Cairo and talk to young people who are protesting, and we want democracy. Well, what does democracy entail? It's a lot of different things, and a lot of the people who were out there protesting Mubarak were not necessarily going for a replacement system. Okay, so what was going to come next wasn't clear, and we just assumed it would be democracy, and we assumed that's the best thing, and we assumed that people would support it. And I think, you know, we assumed incorrectly. We weren't talking to either enough people, the right people, or you know, again, we were only listening to what we wanted to hear. Okay. So I think that's one miscalculation. Of course, we've made lots of miscalculations on the Israeli-Arab conflict of various degrees and what the actual goals are and missions. But that's almost manageable at this point. Again, I think the most fundamental problem, though, and the biggest mistake is if you don't have a sense of what your destination is in a policy, it's pretty hard to get there. I'm paraphrasing a Greek philosopher in saying that, but if you don't have a strategy, everything you do are mere tactics to respond to events rather than to try to shape them. What do we want in this region? If we don't know that, we're not going to get there, and we're going to always be mistaken. Do we want stability in the region? If so, how do we work with what we have to get there? Do we want democracy in the region? If so, what are we going to need to do to get there? If human rights is on the issue in rank of importance 1 to 100, if it's 2, you got to figure out how that fits in, and you still get other things you want. You just have to be able to understand where you're going, and we have not understood that, and we certainly don't understand it now under President Trump yet.
I just want to finish up with something a little bit more optimistic. So what are some of the developments that you see in the region that are going in a positive way?
Well, I mean, you can look at it in a lot of ways. I mean, for one thing, there's a recognition because of these revolts, because of things like in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia implementing these development plans, which aren't just economic development plans, but are societal transformation plans. There's a recognition that the status quo isn't acceptable, that people won't accept it, and whether it's a democracy, a monarchy, or anything else, the government has to be responsive to the people's needs. So I think that's actually quite positive. How you are able to be responsive effectively is something that every country kind of has to learn through trial and error, unfortunately. But that's the nature of the beast. But for every thing negative development, you have to keep sight of this as a longer evolutionary process. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is something like Qatar we can see as a crisis of varying degrees. But like I said, the process of the U.S. not being a leader in this region and these countries kind of deciding what the new rules are going to be for the region is important. They're going to have to do that. You're not going to be able to solve all these problems I mentioned earlier unless these countries understand how to work with each other and how to express their interest in policy that other countries understand. Otherwise, you're going to, so right now you're at a point of Saudi Arabia does this and it surprises other people. Or Egypt does this and it surprises people. Well, eventually they won't be surprises because you'll kind of understand what Egypt's trying to get at, what Saudi Arabia acting without, yes, with U.S. being an important ally, but not the one who kind of helps shape things more, how they act independently. So you can see this is a very negative thing right now, but I think in time it actually becomes quite a positive thing.
I hope to see those changes materialize into something good. Thank you for letting me interview you, and thank you for coming on the show.
Great. Thank you.